This is going to be Combination Therapies. It's going to be with Dr. Tim Cripe, Dr. Chet Villa, and Dr. Byrne. So how do you get there, right? How we've talked and we've had meetings about platform design studies. Could we do a master protocol? Could we put everyone in a master protocol? And how do we get there? And we're anticipating, at least in the United States, that we'll have vamorolone approved, potentially givinostat, gene therapy, antisense oligonucleotides. Would you as a physician, or would you as physicians, if I walked in the door and said, I want everything, would you do it?
So we do a lot of combinations in my field.
Exactly.
That's how we've been able to treat and cure childhood cancer. Yeah, multiple combinations, and not just combinations all at the same time, combinations in phases or different schedules, but it's very complicated. So there's drug-drug interactions to consider. One drug might affect another drug or how it's metabolized. There's side effects that may or may not overlap. And so you can't just willy-nilly throw everything together. This has to be done thoughtfully, carefully, slowly, ideally with data in animal models. We know when we combine small molecule drugs together, they often exacerbate side effects of each other. And so you have to lower the doses and figure that out. Sometimes empirically.
Maybe you could say a little bit about COG and POG and how that played a role in those.
Well, I mean, certainly the history of childhood cancer therapy was that one drug was initially identified, and then another drug, and then another drug, and realized that each one of those alone only had transient effects and that they needed to combine them. And so they began to do that, but certainly in order to do so, it takes a lot of coordination, especially when in this case different drugs have been developed by different folks, and that continues to be a problem today. Can you get two different drug companies to play together? And because if one drug affects the ability of the other drug to work, they may not like that. So getting what we call three-way MTAs or others, where or four-way MTAs, where you're getting them all to agree, can be very challenging. So, but we did it with cooperative groups, as you mentioned, Children's Oncology Group, and multiple different institutions working together.
Those are grassroots efforts.
Grassroots, absolutely.
That's the important part, I think.
But now we're here in gene therapy, right? And these young men and young women, carriers, are on combination therapies like at the get-go, right? They're on steroids, they're on potentially cardiac medicines, and now there's a gene therapy, and maybe for some antisense oligonucleotides layering on top of that. And time is everything. Time is what we have so little of, really. And so how then, as these things are approved, do we need to step back and do animal studies before you as physicians would feel comfortable adding these on? Or how are we going to get there?
No, as Tim said, the example from Children's Oncology was this cooperative effort really grew out of the provider network and then had some federal support to establish a structure to protocolize those combinations so that everyone was on the same page as they came along. And then there was, once it was reasonably well established, everyone participated, I think, is my impression.
That's true, yeah.
And so that got some uniformity. But that should be a lesson to not have 10 different things happening when none of it makes sense in the end, because there were so many critical differences that you haven't learned anything. So that cooperation is important at this stage. There's another aspect of it as well, that I think we even have better tools now for real-world registries and understanding. This happened in hepatitis C. As products were approved and providers began to use combinations based on some logical mechanism of action that would have been helpful, then the data on outcomes was collected in such a way, and this is our Vice President of Health Affairs actually led this effort when he was a practicing hepatologist, and that actually enabled those combinations to be authorized without clinical studies because they had collected prospective data on the combinations in a way that the regulators felt was reliable. And that would be enormously valuable in this field as well. And
So how do you start it? Because right now we have, so there's several registries, as you know. There are going to be proprietary registries for post-marketing on all of these drugs. There's the Action Network of the Heart. There's going to be a bone registry. So how do you, probably not a medical term, scoop it all together?
yeah, that's the basis for Mover, to allow data sets to exist in where they were created, aggregate data into, and then actually compare that to real-time data coming from the EMR. So anything that can be done to integrate these outcomes into the patient's medical record for commercialized therapies, that can be abstracted, and you can look at outcomes based on that. It really started with at least in the Hep C world, it started with the sponsors funding those databases with the expectation that there would be some benefit to them without a significant, a huge outlay as it would have been to do a combination trial. And we might learn something too from what's given the notion of gene therapy is involved in this, and that's like transplant, one of the few medical therapies that you can't discontinue or undo. And so we learned from Zolgensma the additive treatments that are now being utilized, and it really becomes a payer issue more than it is a medical decision-making issue, but that it's certainly happening in that area as well. And so I think you're right, we should expect that there's a standard of care. Someone may receive an advanced therapeutic that is like a gene therapy that is effectively permanent, and then they have opportunities to have additional specific benefits. This might also influence the standard of care medications. Like, let's hope that we reach a point where steroid therapies may not be necessary, at least at the same dose, and we may lessen the side effects of those therapies. So
and that would be, lessening the side effects of steroids, as an example, would be a great idea. But then you have to do a study to figure out what is the lower dose, and can you pile on top of that lower dose. So our registry does integrate, with permission in some of the institutions of the certified centers, the healthcare, the electronic medical record with the patient data. But again, you have all these medicines that you're adding on. And so is there sort of a single system we should develop with all of the people connected to include the Action Network? And I don't know about you, but sometimes we find that academic institutions are not very willing to share their data. So then you've got that. So how is it that we can safely agree to integrate medicines so that we can, if there's a gene therapy, protect what benefit is there, if there's an antisense, protect what's there, and continue that? And I agree, it's a payer issue, right? I think we are all worried that the payers will say, pick one.
It's happened in SMA.
It happened, but in SMA they are combining Zolgensma with several of the other medicines.
But it's on a case-by-case basis.
And the good news, I think, from gene therapy standpoint is once it's given, it's no longer a drug that's being given, right? So a lot of the problems with combination therapies is drug-drug interactions, et cetera, but there's no longer a drug being given. You've got constant expression. And so layering other things on, I don't think will be as problematic from that standpoint, although the combinations of other things may be problematic. But I think it's really important to collect those data, as Barry's talking about, and share those data, and whether that's through a big cooperative network group or multiple cooperative groups like your Action group.
Well, I think that was
all the above.
And to give you an example to what Pat's saying, usually when we talk about research study, the IRB is usually the thing that takes the longest. When Action was established more broadly, the IRB was actually quick. The harder part was actually the data use agreements with each of the individual centers, and at some centers that took over 2 years to be able to get them on board when the IRB had long since been done. And Action was specifically written with a DUA that was broadly written to allow sharing within cardiology and with other centers, and to integrate with some of the advanced kind of cardiac specific therapies. Obviously, we didn't necessarily think about it to those other things, but we tried to write it as broadly as possible, and each year we update it. And to get to your point about, okay, how do we enroll people and to make sure it's not just cardiac focus, this year the change from that perspective is going to be hopefully to allow families in places like this or independently to consent independent of if they're at an action center, because the electronic medical record has allowed us to get access to some of those things. That will be important from a couple of reasons. When we talk about cardiac therapies or any clinical therapy, the people who enroll for trials are generally different than the broader population. That is really important from an FDA perspective because the baseline therapies they may be on may be different in terms of multiplicities of therapy, but also ethnically, geographically, gender-wise, they may also be different. One of the things that is really important about this from a payer perspective and from a clinical perspective is I need to know not just about the specificity of that therapy, but the generalizability of that. We often use these therapies in populations outside of that initial approval, and we don't know whether they're beneficial or not. So there's a scientific reason to make it more generalizable, and we need to find those and define that for multiple therapies over the long term. So we do have to find a solution for this. And because most of the therapies that we're talking about, and hopefully we would move forward with from a cardiac perspective, we're trying to do a different approval pathway than the typical cardiac-based therapies. We need to have longitudinal long-term follow-up. We think we have very good biomarkers based on the natural history data that now exists to be able to move forward from our perspective, but we're going to need to be able to show that over the longer term, and that's going to require, I think, a lot of these, especially as new therapies come on. I think from a cardiac perspective, we are going to push probably in a different way than the neurology groups are, because I think we more and more are seeing we need to move to a single place to do this. We have started to focus around what the science is between action and some of the other groups about how we think a trial needs to be designed. We think for anything that is not heart failure specific, but is focused specifically on antifibrotic or anti-scar effects, it should be plug and play based on all of the data that we have right now. And I think we have to move towards a single profile to be able to do that efficiently, especially as new therapies come along. And I know that has not been necessarily what has happened in the other things, but I think from a cardiology perspective, the data has become clear for how this disease progresses, how slowly it progresses, and how we probably need to move forward, that we are going to need to use that one platform.
So, if money wasn't an object, and it is, I recognize, if we could go to the federal funders today, would you recommend that we start a new system, or a system, or someone take the lead, because we have imaging DMD, we have the Action Network, we have certified centers, we have Mover, we have our registry. If there was a way, what would you recommend? How do we do this quickly? I know that's not quickly as everyone's definition, but if you have someone you care about with Duchenne or Becker, or you're a female carrier in heart failure, for example, soon isn't a very good word, but what could you do now? And what do you recommend us as a community build so that this can be done more quickly and more efficiently and more safely? So Barry.
I think,
or start out, Tim.
Well, I was just going to say, things that have sprung up, Action Network focused on heart failure, industry, sponsored studies with limited groups, et cetera. If you look at the Children's Oncology Group as a paradigm, the members of that group, I think originally by necessity, because cancer's in various parts of the body, et cetera, it's not just oncologists that are members of this group, right? It's radiologists, investigational pharmacists, it's other disciplines, PM&R. There are multiple different subspecialties that are neurologists. And as we've seen today, Duchenne affects the brain, et cetera, et cetera. I would envision a similar kind of group where you have all the different subspecialists, cardiologists, neurologists, radiologists, pharmacologists, et cetera, being members, and then subcommittees within that group. So when we do a study at our site, we report all the data for that study. It may not be the same data that's collected for the next study or different studies, but it all goes to a central area, and then it's all made available to the different subcommittees that who can mine it for information and publications and so forth, learn from it. So this all is centralized sharing, and so it's not just a heart network or just a neuromuscular network, et cetera.
But right now, we're decentralized.
Yeah,
So how do you,
Yeah.
But when that was started, there were federal support for it.
There still is
wasn't there?
federal support. It's NIH funded, but not nearly enough, and a lot of it now is industry sponsored as they come in.
Yeah,
Sponsor
but there has to
studies.
be some nidus, and I think it's really the support organizations like PPMD that have to come together and think about how to get it started, seek external funding through industry sponsorship, and because I think there are plenty of models now where that's benefited mostly the sponsor side of the story, and they will, I think, see that and support it. And there are also structures now, you know, when Children's Oncology Group and Pediatric Oncology Group started, all the data entry was manual out of paper records. Now we have an opportunity because having an electronic medical record and the ability to abstract data, natural language processing of information through AI efforts will make it lower the bar for conducting and make it less expensive to conduct such studies. It just needs these data sharing agreements. As an example, the PCORI network, which also is federally funded, has a children's function. That's one good starting point because it covers all specialties, as you said. They have a data aggregation tool that you can actually get discrete laboratory data on participants for the entire population cared for by that institution. We have one called One Florida that covers 10 million lives, where quarterly data is abstracted so that there can be assessments, the health economic arguments against payer data, lots of big data that actually I think could be the impetus for having this in the context of Duchenne put together.
and do you think now, because we have become, or we are so decentralized over time, right? This wasn't started long ago.
Anticipated.
Right,
yeah,
it wasn't
20 years
anticipated.
ago.
No, I know it wasn't anticipated. If we, as an advocacy organization and group of advocacy organizations, all of us together, went to Congress to try to get an NIH approach to this, do you think people would be willing?
I don't know if that's the right answer because there's not much money there.
Well, there's money.
worth a
somewhere.
try.
I mean,
Children's Oncology Group is way underfunded.
so can you tell me what the funding level was to start?
I don't recall. We can figure that out, but
Okay.
it's certainly way short of what's needed now. So different mechanisms are utilized to supplement the funding. It is a core source of funding.
So what's the
But
guess?
then the
start it?
government also then controls everything that happens. That's the downside.
But it really was launched out of academic health centers. I think we do have to realize that that's where the care is provided. It's not really in a community hospital setting because of the unique needs of patients and families with Duchenne. So you kind of have a sense as to where it should start, and then getting some structure to it is the first step. That's the hardest part of it.
The advantages, like your care centers, is it's very standardized across every center. You know, we have 250 centers that are. You go to any one of them, you basically get the same protocol, the same, and so that not only for care but the same studies. Now, not every place opens every study, or has the capacity to, but they have the opportunity.
But then as things are approved, how does a new if company X comes with a new approval, how do you implement that new approval across that? What do you do with that? Does every center then implement that particular drug into their
Yes.
treatment
Well,
plan?
it's done at the central committee level, and then every center agrees to participate. And if they don't, then they're not for a study, then they're not going to participate. If it's an approval, then they can automatically implement that.
And I think the point about structure is actually really important, right? There's now a common language and a common pathway, especially from a neurologic perspective, about what therapies, what testing needs to be done. We're catching up from a cardiac perspective, but I think we now are starting to coalesce around what we think is the best way to do it. We've learned a little bit more recently about probably what not to do, but I think as a result of that, that has helped us to kind of focus a little bit more about which phase of cardiomyopathy we think would be best to attack, even if some therapies are going to be outside of that, but from a clinical trial perspective. And I think the part is that we also have to mandate that. I mean, I think that is one of the things that we have to talk about. If we are going to talk about cardiac safety from all of these,
That was good, though.
Sorry about that.
From all of these therapies, we cannot just say, right now, for the vast majority of neurologic studies or neuro-based studies, cardiology is there as a safety word. That's it. There is not a consistent cardiac-focused endpoint for many of these trials because it's too far out or some other reason why. But I think we are now at the point that that's not actually okay. These therapies, from a basic perspective, have potential implications. We have actually seen upfront implications, and we need to understand what that means over the long term. So we also have to make it incumbent upon trials that have potential cardiac implications or known cardiac implications that they have a follow-up that we would recommend, not just an echo that's there for safety.
I'll go one further, is that we do a lot of centralized review. So not only should you be doing MRIs, et cetera, but perhaps those should be reviewed centrally by a committee that agrees, also at the local, but at the centralized, so that it's uniformly interpreted.
And this is going to be especially important as one moves to younger ages and those endpoints are beyond 10 years from the initiation of the treatment. For the sponsor's involvement in that program won't continue over that period. And then when that crosses over into adulthood, it becomes even more complicated. I think we have to provide the framework. It'll be part of clinical care, but then the data needs to be centralized, and then there'll be plenty of people who are quite interested in analyzing that data as long as it's aggregated into one place. And that may be a grassroots effort. It may be up to families to say, I'm at year 5 after my treatment, I want to be sure that I'm receiving an MRI done in this way, and then because I'm a participant in a registry study regarding cardiac outcomes, and I'm going to deposit that data in a central repository.
Right. But then there's lots of other things in addition to cardiac that you have to include here, right?
That's just used as an example.
No, I think it's a good example, but how do we then move that all action and all those other registries into central data? Is that a PROCORI project? Is that grassroots? And if you don't want to share it with in terms of NIH criteria, or they have the Fed zone, the data. Okay, that wasn't good, right? For the Fed zone, the data?
No,
generally not.
Okay.
But importantly, it's the patient's data, and they're central to that whole journey. So an organization like PPMD and the community really is naturally the best driver for something that's going to span a decade, because the investigators will come and go, sponsors will come and go, but the family and the patient are the center of that, as you've said. So it really, in some ways, I think an advocacy organization actually can be the catalyst for it to happen.
And do you think if there would be such a catalyst and there would be incentives to participate, and obviously that's dollars, right? Because of all of it takes to get the data collected and analyzed and all of that. Do you think there's a willingness to do it?
Well, we've done this. So Lumazyme, for example, was authorized in 2006 for Pompe disease, and Sanofi was the first registry in lysosomal storage diseases that was established prior to authorization. And there's been excellent participation. One of the incentives for participants in the registry to keep coming back and for centers to collect the data and to also have patient-reported data was that there was an opportunity for individual outcome reports relative to the study population. So patients found that incredibly valuable to say, well, how am I doing compared to the rest? And that informed them about where there might be gaps in their own care. That's easy to implement in a portal where the patient has access to their own data.
Well, I do think patients need their own data, and I know lots of people who've been in trials want to know how did I do in this trial? Was I on placebo for a period of time? Was I on active compound? And how did I do in relationship to the rest of the population? So I do think, but it gets back to the practical, right? If I get gene therapy, would you be willing today to layer on an antisense alongside of that? In the absence of knowledge right now, would you be willing to look at that heart and start Entresto after that? How do we get there in the short term, because the need is now, and what structure we've talked about what structure we could use in the future, but now when we have a gene therapy approval and perhaps more number of other approvals coming, hopefully, and then approved products, how do we get there safely to say to this family, yes, we'll do gene therapy, and then we'll layer on an antisense, and then we'll do something else?
Yeah, I think it's relevant for families, for clinicians, and I think also for payers as well. I mean, we don't like to talk about it, but we all have to deal with the circumstance where I can order all I want. The reason why I'm able to do most of what I do is because an insurance company doesn't look at your diagnosis or other stuff, and they just look at your heart function, and I can get by on all of those. Or if you're a child, they mostly don't pay attention because the numbers are too small. Once you hit into adulthood, or as there are more people and as there are more costs, that becomes an issue. And this may be a place to bring that all together, because we want the data, and to be blunt, they want to get paid. And that may be the way that we move forward in this regard, because we need to know it works. Families need to know it works. And to be able to get paid, you have to understand what that means, one on top of the other. In terms of cardiac function, that is what has become the issue. In terms of guideline-directed medical therapy, right? I talked about all four of those things. To be able to do any of the trials, they needed to know what your baseline therapy was, and you have to be able to match based on those. And I think that will be the structure going forward, right? There is going to have to be an arm. If we don't say it now, there's going to have to be an arm that is going to have to include people who are not on gene therapy and people who are on gene therapy. And if we don't find a way to consistently do that, while we talk about minimizing the amount of placebo time and all of those things, now imagine every single trial will have to have a gene therapy based one and a non-gene therapy based one, and potentially multiple different gene therapy based ones. And I think that more and more is the answer. We have to find a way to put it together into one thing, or you are going to have problems with approval, because the background therapy is going to be very heterogeneous.
Yeah. One problem I maybe point out, that we have a lot to do in our own provider community related to education, because the expectation of the natural history is that there's progressive worsening. And when someone receives a gene therapy, even if it were so successful that it would be effectively curative of the heart disease, the average provider has been indoctrinated into the idea that this is a progressive problem that needs escalating therapy, despite what you might measure in terms of function. So I've encountered this a number of times, like this is a patient who's had a treatment and we don't need to escalate therapy because they've hit this birthday or that milestone or have a blip in one observation. The expectation should be that we should be tracking this as though there's a different setting we're working with, the background has changed. So that's going to take some time to educate everyone, because the care is not given in this small number of sites where there's a lot of experience with it. So that's going to take time.
Time is everything, right? Tim, in the oncology world, do the payers just say, fine, whatever you want to combine, we'll cover it? I mean,
we don't have any $3.2 million treatments. So
okay.
I think that's a different calculus. But yes, if it's something, they don't always say yes. We have to sometimes badger them and call them and talk to them about getting approvals. But if it's something that's been tested and shown there's published data from a clinical trial, then then we usually get it backed up.
But to me, that's going to be the question every single time moving forward now. How is every person in this room not going to then ask, what does it show on gene therapy? What does it show not on gene therapy? And so while many of the companies have said, here are the problems with trying a platform trial of doing all of these things, well, it's now going to be even more complicated. If we're not going to go down that road, I would expect the FDA to say every single time, okay, if the data continues to bear itself out with gene therapy, and if gene therapy is effective, I'm going to need a trial on that and off that. And you're going to have dueling everything. Now repeat that for every single trial moving forward.
That unfortunately probably won't be possible, because if it becomes a standard of care to receive early treatment by a one-time or infrequent therapy, as has happened now in SMA, the far preferred treatment paradigm, is at least in the US, is to receive Zolgensma. So now every additive therapy, like it's being done with myostatin inhibitors or other compounds, is in the context of gene therapy, because there's no off drug after that. So you fundamentally change the genotype of that individual, and that's what those sponsors have to address.
And they're struggling.
No, they've learned, just like in the context of Duchenne, we adopted a standard that wasn't appropriate to enroll patients who had not received steroid therapy yet, and that would be a confounder if it was initiated during the trial. So that became required initially for 6 months, then we've kind of gotten to a more reasonable level of 3 months of prior steroid therapy before enrolling, and I think that may be the case. Of patients who receive gene therapy may say, instead of having them be excluded, which is actually commonly the case now, it may become a requirement to have previously received whatever the best available agent is. Now that there are going to be many choices ultimately there, and that's going to create a new kind of heterogeneity. So it's going to be complicated, but the good news is that in some ways is the good news, that there are options, and I think these problems are solvable. It's better than the alternative.
No, I think the options are wonderful, but if my children were just diagnosed today, the options are so overwhelming that
Yes.
Do you wait for a different gene therapy? Do you take the gene therapy that's approved? Do you put them on cardiac medicines? Do you start steroids? I mean, it's a lot.
Exactly.
And I actually think for new and younger people, then that may be the option. For the older boys who aren't, or it may take some time to be able to be on gene therapy, it's still going to be relevant. It is relevant right now. So it may get simpler for the younger boys, but what about everybody here who's not 5 or 6 or under, or who has other things? And those therapies should not be taken off the table for them, and we're going to have to deal with that part of it.
no, it is a struggle. I mean, it is, I think it's a worry of this community that, you know, depending on the data that comes out of Pfizer study or the phase 3 EMBARK study or the next gene therapies, Regenex, Solid, et cetera, that if there's a limited number or based on a certain functional capability that they say this is the limit, then you've split this community in half, which is terrifying.
Yeah.
Right?
And does that also mean that we actually can't do a cardiac trial now because we know the gene therapy is going to come up? Should we just not do one? Because right now, if I'm going to focus on cardiac therapy, I'm going to focus on people who have LGE, who have systolic dysfunction. So we're generally looking at boys who are going to be 12 and up, and it's going to be a while before we have that gene therapy that comes along, and that may modify that long-term risk. These are going to be regulatory questions as well as clinical questions.
I wish this was easier. There's that, right?
Yeah.
Do you all have questions? I think we have time for a few questions before our last panel.
Okay, oh, this is working good. So we already know that the whatever DMD gene mutation will differentiate like how severe the disease is, and then there's also like the GWAS study out of Dr. Flanagan's. His recent GWAS study indicated like 6 more genes that are expressed that can differentiate disease severity. And then there's also, we have digital twins being used in manufacturing and now being discussed in for clinical trials. Is there anyone kind of like driving for digital twins to kind of put together this complex problem of all the inputs
AI.
that will determine disease severity and the different combination therapies?
Can you repeat that?
It was really hard for us to hear.
Yeah, it's hard for us to hear. Scott,
It's hard for me to talk too. Sorry, I'm a software engineer, so everything's like a software engineering problem. So we're using digital twins quite a bit to try to handle some of these complex problems, and we have a lot of each different DMD mutation is going to have different severity, different reactions to each of these drugs. Then we have all this natural history. Is there anyone kind of pushing a kind of a digital model, like a digital twin of the different types of patients with Duchenne, and use that as a driving force to pull in, kind of harmonize this natural history data and kind of drive the combination therapies, or at least categorize the different cohorts of DMD patients?
Maybe I can take a stab at, as far as I understand, the question is whether we accumulate enough data that we can have predictive outcomes based on historical information using AI models that mimic that patient. And that's essentially a pharmacogenomic approach. It's been applied to other areas in medicine, anticoagulation therapy, for example. And so you could imagine, as we use more and more genomic data to understand the background of an individual and how their response to therapy might be, we're quite interested in doing this currently with the approval of Elevidys to segregate adverse events versus not based on NGS data from everyone who participates. And I encourage all of you who might participate in getting a gene therapy type product that what the baseline genomic information is like, because that's a starting point for doing other studies like RNA-seq and analysis of modifier genes that will change outcomes between some individuals and others. So it's not only about adverse events, but about response, immune response profiles. There'll be a lot to learn over time, and it will be computational phenotypes that we can hopefully learn from and predict.
Well, if we collect enough data, it's not just genotyping, for example. I mean, predictive analytics is about taking the full summation of data from CK levels to
Laboratory data,
whatever else there might be, because there may be predictive elements in there that we don't see, that we can't perceive, but that computational models.
And that'll inform us too about again through the electronic medical record, when there's a certain pattern of findings that may prompt providers to say, or reflex testing that would guide therapy, and that'll happen in the background. So we know that actually, like using the anticoagulation example again, it's predicted that certain responses to given drugs will influence the choice of the initial therapy.
And yeah, so Sarepta kind of reverse engineered that in the SRP 9001. It's the AdCom stuff for the 6 and 7-year-olds, because they said, well, this is where they were on the disease progression chart. Sorry, is this audio awful? But if we can go in, starting the clinical trials, use that essentially where they are in their disease progression to predict the outcomes. I expect that to be cleaner, but that's not the way we're doing clinical trials yet.
I think the reality is we're in the initial phases of doing that will become more ready for prime time. That's what we all hope it will be with time. You need more data, and we have to figure out how to apply that. I think it's something that every field, especially from a cardiac perspective, I'll speak to that, everybody is interested in doing. No one has figured out how to do it reliably yet, and how to apply it. But I think what you saw from the Sarepta trial is what we think can be done in a machine-based way that is probably even better than what we did, based on choosing what we thought would make a difference and what predicts outcome.
Pat, other side, Pat.
Question? Question over here.
Hi. So I'm hoping I heard incorrectly, but I want to clarify. So I have, and we've all heard for 10 years, that ASOs and gene therapy will be complementary combination therapies. In 2018, even though Billy, my son, says I have a horrible memory, I don't, but it was in 2018 at conference when I was asked to be in a gene therapy focus group. So I asked the question, have animal studies begun on combination therapies? And I was told yes. But I think I heard at the very start of this session that they haven't. So I want clarification on that. I think that's very important. And if they have not begun, and that was 5 years ago, that's a huge setback and delay, in my opinion. So the other question I have is, how real is the scenario that we may have to pick one, either ASO or gene therapy? But I'm really interested in the answer to the first question about animal studies and combination therapies.
I mean, there are certainly publications in animal models where they've used both and shown it actually to be more effective, because they're independent mechanisms, so there's no theoretical reason why they couldn't both be used together, and shouldn't interfere with each other, for example, or have overlapping side effects with each other that would preclude it. So I know those preclinical studies, some have been done.
But it's not progressed more from then? The question is, have there been animal studies for the combination therapies?
What kind of animal studies are needed for combination therapies?
Have they begun? I was told yes, and this was back in 2018. In this focus group, I was told yes.
There's a little echo, but are you asking, have there been animal studies to use combinations like antisense oligonucleotides with a gene therapy?
Yes.
Have those been complementary, or has one outcompeted the other?
Have the studies begun is the real question. I was told yes.
Barry,
with
do
the
you know?
ASOs and gene therapy.
Studies of combinations of antisense plus gene therapy? And are they complementary, or will one outcompete another?
Yeah, well, at least in gene augmentation or gene replacement therapy, that's operating independently. It'll become a little more complicated when there's actually gene correction. So there's not really inherent reason why there should be competition as long as the goal is restoring dystrophin expression. I think we'll see that it's better if there's some orthogonal or separate mechanism that is the rationale behind adding something. So having two different ways to, if you had 50% of wild-type dystrophin levels in half the cells, adding another 0.5% by another agent that requires, the burden of, there's going to be some burden of care of repeated therapies. That's one that may not be as advantageous as another mechanism entirely like protecting fast switch fibers as is being pursued by Edgewise. That's a combination therapy where you expect there to be two levers to pull that are going to improve outcome.
So I think that is the dilemma, right? If my children were your patients and they had gene therapy, and let's theoretically say there's an approved antisense for them, and let's say the Edgewise drug was approved, would you add both? How would we talk about what is the next best step for us?
Yeah, when there are two approved therapies and they're both in this challenging area where they're costly, the decisions won't really be medical then. And that's very frustrating because it becomes entirely a financial decision of the payer. And that's why I think there's really got to be a strong effort to make all of these fit in the life cycle. So in hemophilia care, for example, there's not the expectation that if retreatment's necessary, the patients will pay again, or the payer will pay again, and that, in fact, Byrne has acknowledged that they think that upfront payment is a lifetime coverage, if you will. They have to build in some mechanisms for rebates, and that's been done for the eye care. If Luxturna, it stops working, actually the Spark agrees to return the payment. So it's a very interesting model.
Well, that would be an interesting model. I've heard of that model before where there's a rebate essentially if something stops working.
Right.
I'm not sure in rare disease that's going to be an easy mark.
I don't know that it's actually been challenged, but
it'd be heartbreaking, actually.
Conceptual.
Well, if something stops working, I think patients and families I know have discontinued drugs for when the benefit-risk analysis is not there, when it's much more risk or greater risk than it is benefit. But boy, if you had two that should be combined and then the payer says no, that's pretty
And
heartbreaking.
we in the case of SMA, we can make patient-specific agreements, and then we develop a rationale as to why that adjunctive therapy is needed when there's a change in the in the expected trajectory, when a patient's worsening. We face that in many cases. So children with SMA may not be excluded from gene therapy initially because of maternal antibody. They start on Spinraza and they don't have a benefit. We then develop the rationale as to why they should get the gene therapy. Now we have a third agent, risdiplam, can be added even in newborns. And so, but those are been case by case.
The real question was, though, just to take another second, I don't know that I'd want to give my son both unless we have data supporting safety with both an ASO and a gene therapy. That was my question. I was told in 2018 that animal studies were being conducted back then, but from what I'm hearing now, it doesn't sound like they have. So that's my real question. I think we know that they're complementary. They should complement each other. But is there data that it's been conducted in animals and is it safe?
Yeah, Terry, I don't think the animal data of each one of those oligos that are approved currently, or maybe in development, or even currently in studies, have been tested against or will be tested against a gene therapy to see. Because, I mean, as the antisense oligonucleotide world expands with the prediction that it could treat any number of 75 or 80% of the patients, I don't think they'll do all that animal work. I could be wrong, but I can't imagine anyone will do it. Last question.
Hey, Pat, it's Megan. So I'm Megan Freed with PPMD. I just really have a comment that I hope might tie some of this all together as we close. The infrastructure, the technology infrastructure for sharing disparate sources of data does exist, right? It is not a new or novel thing. In fact, PPMD has what we call a Duchenne Outcomes Research Interchange. This is our data warehouse that we built several years ago with the sponsorship of Sarepta, that currently houses various different types of Duchenne data, from post-market surveillance data to our PRO registry data to EHR data that we're currently extracting from our clinics. So I just want to say that I think what we really need here is champions, right? We need the community to understand the importance of sharing their data and consenting to studies to do so. And we really need the medical clinicians to champion these types of projects in the academic setting. There are a number of hurdles despite the federal legislation, but we have definitely found that when there are champions in the institution, we can succeed much faster on getting to understand what some of these things look like when we combine the data.
Thank you, Megan. More to come on this. I thank you very much. More to come on combination therapies, because we have to get there, and then we'll have to advocate for the payers to recognize the value of combination therapy so that the people we love have long, productive, functional lives, and we'll need to be doing some work on that. Thank you very much. Our last panel is coming up.